The following is our live podcast from the desert in Mesa, Arizona at Baseball HQ's First Pitch Arizona 2024. We'll talk about the pitfalls of not using projections, relying on playoff stats, fab spending, the stolen base landscape, Elly De La Cruz, what the first round of 2025 drafts will look like, audience questions, and much, much more. This jam-packed live episode from Mesa, Arizona is next on Beat the Shift. Welcome to another episode of the Beat the Shift podcast. I'm your host, Ariel Cohen. Ruvain Guy not here tonight. He sends his wishes. He's especially sad because the Mets had such a great season, which we may or may not talk about later. But I want to welcome our guest. We are live at Mesa, Arizona at First Pitch.
Woo!
Yes. And we have a special guest today from CBS, Chris Towers.
Hey, how's it going?
Doing well. And we got Sarah Sanchez here.
Hello, how's it going?
Doing great. Welcome, everyone, for our maybe fourth or fifth live episode that we've done here from the desert. And so much to talk about. But, of course, the most important thing is, who is the most important free agent to sign this year? Well, who can tell me who's been on the World Series roster for the last 5 years in a row? Will Smith.
Well, yes, Annie Will Smith. Yes.
Annie Will Smith. Ruvain told me this today. But you had the catcher, Will Smith, for the Dodgers. Three consecutive, the pitcher, Will Smith, and before that was the other Will Smith. So I got news for all you GMs out there. If you want to win, go with Will Smith. All right, we're going to jump right into it as we usually do on the show with our strategy section. And, well, we got to talk projections once again, as we usually do. So my first question we'll throw out to the group here. Are projections getting more accurate? And are they more important to use than ever? Meaning, are you behind the eight ball if you aren't using them? Chris?
Well, I don't know if it's good to answer a question with a question, but I feel like that's one for you. Like
Yeah.
This is your, like, I tend to be like a techno optimist on the whole. So I assume, given all the data that we have and, you know, the various projection systems that are out there, both that do and don't take StatCast data into account, I'm operating under the assumption that we're getting better at this. It's always going to be, there are going to be limits to how accurate anything can be in a game as noisy as baseball. We know, relievers are always going to be hard to project because they're throwing the equivalent of 12 starts worth of innings every year. It's just not enough data. So, like, that's always going to be hard. Rookies are always going to be hard. And I feel like projecting rookies has kind of become, I don't know if it's become more difficult, but they're certainly not hitting the ground running the same way they had, 5 years ago, certainly. So I think on the whole, they're probably getting more accurate, and it needs to be a part of your process, whether you're building your own rankings, whether you are, just playing. There are going to be things that projections have limitations on. But if you're not, you have to have some kind of process. You have to have some kind of grounding. And I think projections, like, that's how I start my process of ranking is, looking at various projection systems, kind of putting it all together, and then going from there and building on top of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that projections are essential. I don't disagree with anything that Towers just said, but I will say that I think projections are getting more information, but they still require a lot of parsing and context to be more accurate. And I don't think that we should confuse information with accuracy. So one of the things that I did in answering this question is I went back and looked at the spreadsheets that I used for drafts in 2024. It's like a straight valuation spreadsheet that is informed by the BADX or by ATC, and then I compared it to the Fangraphs Player Rater in terms of where players landed. And for some players, we did really well, like Bobby Witt was 2-3 in that system, right? You've got Aaron Judge, who comes in at 11-2 in that system. You've got Shohei Ohtani, who comes in at like 13-1 in that system. You've got Jose Ramirez, who comes in at like 14-4, and Juan Soto, who comes in at like 10-6. But there are some big misses too, and there are misses that can cost you your league. So you've got Julio Rodriguez, who comes in at 3 in the early season projections. He comes in at 59 on the Fangraphs player rater. You've got Corbin Carroll, who comes in at 4 and 28. Mookie Betts, who comes in at 5 and 62. And admittedly, I know some of these are injuries, and like we can't necessarily predict those in advance, but these are the types of things that change your season if you're taking these guys in the first or second round. Kyle Tucker comes in at 6 and 153. Fernando Tatis Jr., 7 and 151. So I think that one of the things that I took away from this question is, yes, more information, not necessarily more accuracy. And the other thing that I noticed is that the biggest misses seem to be on pitchers. So you've got starting pitchers like Strider, Cole, and Burns going in the top 2 rounds in every
Strider
single
was
draft.
injured, though.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed, but not really giving you the value that you expected in that first round pick if you took him. And I took him number 2 overall in Tout Wars last year, and it killed me, right? The pitchers who really crushed last year were Tarek Skubal, Zach Wheeler, Chris Sale, Paul Skeens, Shota Imanaga, and Seth Lugo, none of whom went in the top 3 rounds. And I think that we should keep that in mind when we're looking at the accuracy versus information perspective on projections.
And, you know, that group of pitchers that you mentioned that outperformed, I think the most interesting part of that specific group that you mentioned, outside of Wheeler, really limited samples of success for all of them. You know, you had 2 rookies in that group. You had Chris Sale, who has still had a lot of good things about him, but hasn't been able to stay healthy, has had inflated ERAs. So I think, you know, pitching is inherently more volatile, inherently more fragile. That's always going to be a problem when you're projecting. But, yeah, it has to be a part of your process. Like I said, for me, that's how I start, and then I, you know, weave in personal preferences or data that I think, you know, projections might not be picking up on. But you always have to be careful with that too, because you can talk yourself into, look what this guy did over the last 2 months of the season. Sometimes that works out. I think, Errol, you would probably agree, a full season projection is going to be, on the whole, more, or full season worth of data is going to be more valuable for projecting moving forward than any given 2-month slice. And you can always try to but I know that this 2-month slice is what matters. And it's like, yes, sometimes it happens. Tarek Skubal worked out really well. We basically had 2.5 months of him pitching like the best pitcher in baseball. He went out and was the best pitcher in baseball.
Yeah.
Sometimes it works out like that. Doesn't always.
Yeah, so projections on the whole are getting more accurate. I mean, 2020 was the outlier because of the short season and the year after, but projections are getting more accurate. What I will say, though, is that the market is getting closer to projections. Mm-hmm. That's the interesting thing. So if you're looking at profitability of projections, it's a little bit harder. I look at profitability of projections based on how it compares to the market. Well, the gap has shortened. So that's something to really think about it. Now, question for you is, what are the biggest blind spots of projections? Now, we know there are blind spots, but what are the blind spots that everyone is actually taking into account correctly, that they know about it but account for it, and maybe some things that people are still just not taking into account of? We know it's a blind spot of projections, but still nobody's really taking into account of it.
So I mentioned one already, which is injuries, and obviously that matters a lot here in terms of where players are going to wind up and where they start. But I think that less obvious and something that we should really consider as we're thinking about our drafts going forward is structural stuff and unpredictable park effects. And so anybody who's in the room who knows me already, you know that I'm a Cubs fan. Wrigley Field in 2024 was the second worst park to hit in, with a park factor of 91. It was just barely above T-Mobile Park, which has a park factor of 89. It was actually worse for power last year. So if you drafted Cubs hoping that you were going to get home runs in your leagues, you were apoplectic because they were not hitting home runs, right? And one of the things that we need to think about that projections cannot take into consideration is future park effects. Any shenanigans that are happening with the ball, any changes that are happening with the humidor, anything that is happening structurally that is going to impact a park specifically, those are not things that are being taken into account in projections, and you have to know that those are things that are going to happen during the course of a season.
And it's going to be especially tough this year. Like, I think in 2024 there was one really good example besides the Cubs that you mentioned is Cleveland all of a sudden became this really good park for left-handed power, especially. And from what I understand, it was like they moved a couple of rows and like put container boxes in one specific area, and it changed the wind patterns in this park in a way that just dramatically changed the way the park played. And you saw, Jose Ramirez, I think, had a career high in home runs. Josh Naylor had his best season. So specifically for left-handed power hitters in Cleveland, you saw this dramatic change in the way the park played. And then you have, it's going to be a real challenge for 2025 because we've got the A's, I almost said Oakland, but the Sacramento Athletics, the Athletics Baseball Club, are going to be playing in what's going to be really difficult is it's going to be a different playing surface, which matters. They're taking out a field turf surface in Sacramento. They're replacing it with grass. It's an extremely hot place to play during the summer. Yeah. It's also a PCL league, so how does that impact, how do you transfer the park factors for a PCL league, right, but one of the pitchers' parks, relatively speaking, the PCL, because it's not at elevation? How do you account for that? How do you account for the fact that players are going to be playing in what is, I think, by all accounts, going to be a substandard facility? Like that's something that's just, you can't possibly account for that.
Can I jump in on that for 1 second? The other place that's going to matter a lot is for Tampa Bay, where it looks like they're not going to be able to play at their park. The roof is gone, and that's not going to be a place where those hitters can play. That is a park that has really challenged hitters. I would, go back and look at what Willy Adames said about the batter's eye and the struggles that he had there, why he became such a better hitter when he went to the Brewers. But the projections right now are that they might play at Dunedin. Well, Dunedin is where Vladito went off last year, right? So if you're thinking about some of those structural considerations for park effects that are not going to be taken into account in projections, I think those are the types of things you need to be thinking about as a fantasy manager.
And that's just interesting that the conversation went here into park factors. I mean, there's other stuff, injuries. Do we think that, projections obviously don't take into account if the guy was playing injured last year and probably was better, right? But if you have that knowledge, and sometimes you do, I can see that as a gain for people.
Or you can look at like Anthony Volpe, who had this really, really disappointing, I think, really rookie and sophomore seasons, but then in the second half of this year, all of a sudden just started swinging the bat harder, which is something that we can now track through StatCast.
Swing changes.
Yeah, right, and then in the postseason, I think his average exit velocity was like 96 miles per hour in the postseason, which is like Aaron Judge levels, which is not something that Anthony Volpe should be able to do consistently. But if he can, that would be a something that projections may not take into account that could make Anthony Volpe a real value next year.
So we usually have Derek Carty on the show here live. He's not here, but I wanted to see his take. So this is what he said. So Carty says, so while this is a blanket generalization, it's not the case for everyone. I'd say for the most part, people don't take into account stuff well. Even if they recognize a blind spot like injury, they're just guessing and they're doing more harm. Basically, I'm not going to read the whole thing. He basically should just use projections. Don't worry. Carty said that. The only thing, he gave a small, the only thing I'd say is that on the whole, people do better with playing time. And I can tell you from, doing the projections that in terms of rates, even if you have insight, if you want to guess, I think there's some reason here, playing with the levers yourself on rates does more harm than good. Not so playing time. If you see a high-skilled player that hey, well, he's projected for, 10-10, but with small playing time, wait a minute, maybe he can. A guy like Brenton Doyle, I saw, wait a minute, very high skill, a lot of homers, but is he going to play? Well, he's a very good fielder. He'll probably get a lot more playing time. If he hits right away, they're going to play him more. Guys like that, I used to call it the Ben Zobrist law, where's he going to play? He's only going to play 4 days a week, I don't know. But when you have a high-skilled player, they'll find players.
Life finds a way. That's the way we always talk about it on FPT.
And playing time is really where you can dominate by having your own input. But yes, projections, don't touch too much or you'll be bad. Let's talk about projections in terms of what do we do with prospects? Because sometimes you have prospects playing in playoffs who all of a sudden go off. And, I mean, how about, like Mark Vientos of the Mets? Any Mets fans here? Yeah, what a year. By the way, did anybody see the Mark Vientos' article in the Player Tribune? Did anybody see that? I did. If you haven't seen it, read that article. Amazing article. But in general, what do you think about, should we be factoring in playoff performance for anyone, for prospects going forward?
That's really tough. Like with Vientos, there are, I think, two things we can say with a decent amount of accuracy about Mark Vientos. Hits the ball really hard. doesn't hit the ball as often as you'd like. That was, it got a lot better in 2024. It led to his breakout over the final 4 months, but still talking about, I think he was bottom 15 in end zone contact rate last season. And then in the postseason, he has this great postseason. I think the OPS is like 960. Kind of looks like what a best case scenario Mark Vientos outcome could be. Still struck out, I think, 33% of the time. And so that's the thing for me when I'm looking at, like, generally speaking, I think the smaller the sample size, you're more likely to just throw it out. Playoffs, I think you can make the case because it's a heightened level of competition, because you're facing the best of the best. If you do succeed, I think you can make that case. But I think I want to learn something new about a player if it's a smaller sample size. So that's how I look at, like, spring training. It's how I look at, early season or any partial stat is just, am I learning new information about a player? So when I think about the playoffs, Vientos, I don't know if I do, because that might just be, like, he had 58 plate appearances. I think he hit 5 home runs. That's a normal Mark Vientos stretch. Like, he had several stretches like that, where I look at Walker Buehler, who openly talked about he wasn't quite sure if his elbow could stay healthy in the season. He was kind of working on his mechanics throughout. And then he said the last 2 games of the playoffs, and then that the save in Game 5 as well, he basically just said, like, I just went out and aired it out. I stopped worrying about it. Well, if I get hurt, I get hurt. That kind of thing. And, like, how transferable is that to 2025? I think the free agent marketplace will probably tell us something about how teams view him, but that looked like new information. His stuff just looked a lot better the final 2 games. Same with Anthony Volpe.
So, I mean, it's funny because playoffs have a lot of conflicting things. Teams play different. Like, there's no fifth starters in the playoffs. The bullpen takes over. They're pitching most of the game. There's also the fact that people are fatigued at the end of the season, right? So it's a little bit different than the regular season. Of course, as you mentioned, that the competition is theoretically at a higher level. You're playing the playoff teams. So, should you use it or not? I mean, my view is that yes, because if anything, it's information. Not only that,
data,
it's most recent information. I'd rather take a healthy person right now with the very most recent than look at 2 years ago data, 3 years ago data, right? It tells you more about what's going forward. So you factor it in my opinion, as, it's 58 at-bats. Well, 58 at-bats as part of a whole for the season.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that in the case of a prospect like a Mark Vientos, 58 at-bats is not a non-substantial sample size for the amount of time that he has played in the major leagues. You're also seeing that adjustment to the adjustment, right? Like, I am less likely to let a hot streak in the playoffs adjust how I view a player like an Anthony Rizzo, who's been in this league for 10 years, and we know who he is, and we know what he's going to do. And if he got hot in the playoffs, that's one thing. But a Mark Vientos, it's like, okay, maybe we're seeing another level here. The guy who immediately came to mind for me when I was looking at this question was Brandon Pfaadt, actually, from last year's playoffs, who had an outstanding playoffs after not having a very good season. And the thing about Pfaadt, look, did he win your league last year? Probably not. Was he the most exceptional pitcher ever last year? Probably not. Was he a guy who you're like, I'm going to take him in the first 10 rounds? I hope not. But he is a guy who threw 181 and a third innings last season. He put up $3.3 worth of value, according to the Fangraphs Player Rater. And that is a useful pitcher for you. That is a useful pitcher for you who went after pick 250 last year, and we saw that for the first time in the playoffs last season. If you were judging Brandon Pfaadt off the season that he had in 2023, you weren't going to pick him there. If you're judging him off of what he did in the playoffs plus 2023, then maybe you do. And so I think that for prospects in particular, the playoffs can provide a yes and. They can provide a little bit of a bump for how we evaluate them and the information we have on people who have a definitionally small sample size.
So let's do a quick who'd you rather in terms of where would you rank Mark Vientos right now as we're sitting here for early 2025 drafts? Well, let's see. We got a question here. Oh, rank him first. Oh, okay.
That's
got
Jason
in the
Collette.
back.
Yeah.
Jason Collette says number 1. So let's see. Stop me, guys, if any of these guys you would take Vientos over. But Jose Ramirez, we're still good.
Nope.
Ellie De La Cruz,
Nope.
no. Gunnar Henderson,
Nope.
Vlad, Machado, Rafael Devers, still
Nope.
going, right? Jazz Chisholm?
No.
No.
Yeah, take Jazz.
Matt Chapman?
No.
I struggle with Matt. Matt Chapman had such a weird year that I don't know what to make of it. Like, he had 20 more RBI or runs than RBI despite hitting 4th and 5th. He stole 14 bases, something like. He had way more steals than he had ever had in his whole career before it. So I don't know what to make of Chapman. I think I would rank Vientos ahead of Chapman.
Who here would take Vientos over Chapman right now? About half the room. All right. What about Austin Riley?
No.
Riley for sure.
We're taking Riley. Okay. Alec Bohm.
Vientos.
Closer.
Raise your hand for
Closer.
Vientos. Okay, it's about 65% of the room. Okay.
Bohm is just so boring.
What about Bregman? We taking
Closer.
Bregman over him?
It depends on where he goes.
Depends where he
That's
goes.
Okay.
exactly right.
Well, right now we don't know where he goes. Who's taking Bregman tomorrow over Vientos?
I'd still go Bregman.
Bregman. Okay, it's close. Eugenio Suarez had an amazing year this year. Who's taking Vientos over Suarez?
I'll take Vientos over
I'll take
Suarez.
Vientos.
You
I
hit
will
my
too.
line.
Nolan Arenado?
Yes, absolutely.
Vientos for sure.
I'll take Vientos. Spencer Steer.
No,
You would take Spencer Steer over him.
I would, because the park effect in Cincinnati is such that I absolutely love Spencer Steer. And I also think that Spencer Steer does not get enough credit for the multi-positional eligibility that he gives you. He absolutely gives you so much flexibility in your lineup. He does a bunch of things that a normal third baseman does not do. So Spencer Steer is a guy that I have above Mark Vientos, but now you're at like the 2 to 3 guys that are
Okay,
in the line.
we're here in the range, I think, where he goes. I mean, I'll do one or two more. Jake Berger, who's taking Jake Berger over
Vientos.
Vientos, right? Willie Castro? No.
Vientos.
So we got Vientos somewhere around number 12, 15-ish. Third baseman. That sounds pretty good. Where will he go in draft? Is he going to be overvalued or undervalued?
So one thing that I will point out about the group that you mentioned is a handful of those guys aren't going to be third base eligible in a lot of leagues. So like,
Okay.
this is like
Is Vlad third base eligible?
I don't
Probably not, yeah.
at least in CBS where I do my rankings, he's not, Ellie's not, and
Right.
I don't think Steer is, and I don't think
Okay. Right, okay, that's true.
Gunnar Henderson is as well. So that's the thing.
That's true, that's true.
Third base is outside of Jose Ramirez. I think it's sort of wide open, and you could
Right.
kind of go. But I do think Vientos is probably like third, maybe fourth tier. I think Jose Ramirez is in a tier of his own. Then it's
Right.
pick your poison of Devers, Riley, Machado, and Jazz. I think.
Let's talk a little bit about in season. We tend to see hot players bubble up somewhere in the middle of the season, and the question always comes, hey, should we, ignore their projections and take a gamble on these hot guys? Of course, there's the opportunity cost of who am I throwing away? Oh, I really thought this guy would be good. Should I hold him any longer? When to do that? So I want to get you guys' take on how quickly do you pick up a guy on a hot streak and how quickly do you throw away somebody else? Meaning, when do you flip projections and say, the heck with projections? I asked this, by the way, to Derek Carty, and he said never get rid of projections. But yes.
So a couple of things. One of the best lessons in fantasy baseball that I learned, and I tried to play more religiously by it over the last couple of years, is to always use my 4 or 5 last picks as guys who I'm totally okay dropping. Guys that I am not going to worry about if I have to drop them for the hot hand. Guys that I am not super in on, guys that I am not super invested in, because you want to have some portion of your roster that is available for churn so you can ride the hot streak when it happens. And if you have that churn factor built into your roster when you build it, then I think that you should be quick on these guys and you should not feel bad about it, right? Like you're just churning on the last guy that you picked. You don't care that much about that guy. You're not that invested in that guy. Ride the hot streak, see what happens when the hot streak ends. Churn that guy for somebody else. But if you wind up on a hot streak that winds up being a league winner, you can feel pretty good about that. So, for example, a guy that I took in the final 4 rounds in a lot of drafts last year was Bryce Terang. And I kept Bryce Terang on my roster for a solid 2/3 of the season because he was absolutely crushing it on a great offense, stealing bases and playing every single day, right? Like that didn't last the entire season. But if you got the first 2/3 of the season from Bryce Terang, you were pretty happy with that in your leagues. And so I think that the question about having the ability to take advantage of the hot hand often starts in the draft. You have to have the spots that you're willing to churn for that spot. And then the question is just, do you ride it or do you not? And are you willing to cut bait on that? And if you're willing to cut bait, that's easy. The last thing that I will say here is look for systemic things that might be driving that hot streak, right? Like I think Vientos is a really good example of a guy who has some systemic things going on that are driving the hot streak that didn't pan out for him in his first time through the league. He has a barrel rate of 14.1%. That's a 92nd percentile barrel rate. The man, when he crushes a ball, makes contact, and it is loud. And he didn't get all of those opportunities early because he was fighting for playing time with Brett Beatty. He was fighting for playing time with Ronnie Mauricio, who, don't forget about Ronnie Mauricio in your drafts this year, y'all. He's coming back from
I
an
like that
ACL
this discussion
injury.
has the Mets positive this year. It's not often that it happens.
And he's going to be great. Like, it's a little bit of a crowded roster, but I think Ronnie Mauricio is going to do some things. And so one of the things to keep in mind is there something systemic going on here that I feel like I can hang my hat on? And if so, ride that hot streak as long as you can.
Yeah, and ultimately, how aggressive you need to be on waiver wire, it depends on your roster. If you have a roster with relatively few holes, you will eventually reach a point where it's just, I don't have anybody that I'm comfortable dropping, and that's okay.
Yeah.
But there's Tyler Fitzgerald's. This happens every year where there are guys who come out and, have 2 really good months basically out of nowhere, right? Tyler Fitzgerald was not a guy who hit the ball especially hard, but he had pretty good AAA numbers. He was a very good athlete, and he came out and set the world on fire. It didn't last, and you run the risk of, hey, this guy had a good week, I'm going to leave him in there, and then you just leave him in there for 3 weeks, and he kills you for 3 weeks. That'll happen just as often as you stumble into the league winner. So I would say, as a fantasy player, this is probably my biggest weakness. Like, I tend to trust the process too much, and I do think you have to be fairly aggressive in in-season management because there's the opportunity cost of who you're dropping, but there's also the opportunity cost of, if this is one of those guys who becomes even a $15 player and you pick him up in May, that's a huge benefit for a fab pickup, for effectively free. And so
you're certainly not going to drop somebody, though, after
what's
a
the
week.
process, right? What's the process?
Well, that's what we're trying to figure out here.
It's like Tyler Fitzgerald is such a good example because he had a homer stretch that was, I can't remember what it was, 6 homers in 8 games or something that Barry Bonds had never done. It was the most homers in X number of games in Giants history. There was no way to see that coming. If you jumped on him early, you got a good month and a half after that stretch, and it ended up working really well. Was there a reason to believe that Tyler Fitzgerald was going to set the world on fire for a month and a half? I'm sure someone out there believes that. I'm sure there are people who were in on Tyler Fitzgerald in AAA and saw him and said, that's a guy who's going to be a fantasy superstar. I don't know if there was data to back that up, and so it's a really hard question to answer.
Yeah.
I think you just got to be willing to take your chances and churn, because having as many opportunities as possible is ultimately, I think, the best way to get the bang for your buck in fab.
One last thing that I want to add on this, I totally agree with that. Like, for every guy that you're super in on, there are other guys who are not going to pan out. I think looking for things that are going on that are systemic that can boost a player's profile are also really helpful here. So one of the things that's really interesting about Vientos, for example, the Mets were the 7th best offense at generating runs last year. If you looked at the Mets early in the season in April or May and you were like, I'm going to be all in on the Mets, that was a bad decision because they were 17th or 18th in generating runs. But they were 2nd starting in June, and they just crushed that all the way through, right? So you have to be flexible with your perceptions of hey, actually, I thought the Mets weren't going to create a ton of runs, and now the Mets are creating runs, and all of a sudden Mark Vientos looks a lot better than he did before.
I love this Mets talk. I really do. So the question is always, look, when I'm going through fab, obviously, you might know of some changes, some injury stuff, but what do you go? You go to the waiver wire and you say, okay, who's got a ton of runs scored? Who's got a ton of home runs? And you say, all right, those guys are obviously hot. And the question is, if I had an unlimited roster space, I'd pick them all up, right? You want to go for it and see what sticks. But the question more is opportunity cost. When are you going to let go? Obviously, if somebody stinks for 3 months, you're letting go of them. But
we had people who would send us messages on Twitter. I'm dropping Corbin Carroll. This is ridiculous. He's never going to turn around.
Well, he's also above a tier.
It's June. It's time. But this is how people play. People play, and they'll say, it's June and he's done. He's got 7 home runs. Why are you still defending him? And if you dropped him, and I'm sure some people did, it looks really dumb.
So I mean, it has to do, obviously, if you're drafting somebody in the first 5 rounds, you're going to have a lot more leeway, and you might want to wait 3 months. If you're drafting somebody in rounds 5 through 10, you might want to give them 5 weeks, 8 weeks. Or if you're dropping somebody at the bottom, yeah, you can go pretty quickly. I would caution, though, give it at least a week or two, because do trust your projections. If you do have an inkling about a person, especially when you're thinking about whether they're going to gain playing time. I know we talked about Brenton Doyle before, but I've spoken to somebody who said, yeah, I dropped Brenton Doyle in a 12-team league. I just needed this spot. Oops, I guessed wrong. Well, if you had a suspicion there, maybe a little bit more holding on to. It's obviously not a question, do this, but you have to make for yourself before the season, okay, I'm going to trust these bottom guys in the roster for 2-3 weeks. I'm going to trust this batch up to a month. Do rely on projections, but obviously you have to have some kind of game plan. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about, a little bit of fab, a little bit about big fab spending. What I've noticed from playing is that teams that do well, and you guys in the audience, tell me if you agree with this. Teams that do well actually have a lot of fab left later in the season. They don't actually spend big during the season. Do you guys agree with that? And somewhat, mostly, because when you don't have injuries, you're doing well, and lo and behold, you don't have to spend fab, right? It's not like you actually need to spend, oh my God, that guy's coming up, let's spend $250. Well, that's only if you weren't doing well. The better play in general is to limit your big spending. The critical 20 out of 1,000, 40 out of 1,000, 10 out of 1,000, just getting those guys, and hey, they can turn into good guys. The probability of picking up somebody with a $10 bid versus a $200 bid of succeeding, it's probably the same, actually.
It's probably more similar than we think. And I think there's also, the cost benefit of if you hit on that guy in April, whoever the big, Luis Gil, let's say, you hit on him in April and you get 5 months of really good production. And then you hit on a guy in August and you get a month and a half. Obviously, Luis Gil was the much better pickup than Spencer Arrighetti, even if their overall impact when you started them might have been pretty similar. So there's that where the longer you wait, you want to be sure that you're going to spend $400 on someone who's going to be impactful. You're never really going to be sure unless a really good player gets dropped.
And you're getting them for early in the season. You're getting them for a longer. But I'll ask you, Sarah, though. Is there a case for these big fab spends? I just haven't seen it myself.
I think there is, but I think, like Chris said, it depends on when they're happening and for which players. And so, for example, I used to sort of divvy up my fab. I would think about it from a week-to-week situation. I'm like, I need to spend this much money this week and this much money this week. And if I wind up spending big on some huge prospect in the middle, then I have to adjust my fab budget accordingly. Obviously, that's for a league where there are not $0 bids, because if you have $0 bids, you can still make some changes later in the season and you can figure those things out, right? But if there are not $0 bids, then you have to be able to have some fab left at the end. I do think, though, however, at this point in time, I'm more of a 70-30 girl in terms of how I allocate my fab. I think that 70% of it should be spent prior to the first half, prior to the All-Star break. And I mean, this is not perfect, right? Like if I spent 65% instead of 70%, I'm not feeling bad about it. But the idea is that you are investing early in some of these players that Chris is talking about. You get an entire season of a Luis Gil rather than trying to wait it out until the very end. And you still have some money to make moves and make sure that your roster is full in the final weeks of the season. I think the other thing for fab that is really tough, though, is we don't have any metric that dictates how your league is going to react to fab. If you're in a league of people that you've played with for a long time, you might have a really good gauge of this is the bid that it's going to take for me to land this player. Chris and I play in the same Tout Wars league. I think I have a pretty good gauge of what it takes to land a player in that league.
Sure.
I don't know that for half of the NFBC leagues I play in because I don't know all the people in those leagues nearly as well, and I'm not used to seeing their fab bids, so I'm basically guessing every week when I put my money out.
It only takes one a-hole, I guess, is the...
You're bidding against the highest number.
Yeah, like, if there's one person in your league, like, let's say you've got your reasonable fab bids out there. If there's one person in your league that wants the highest player more than anyone else. Like this is when one of the nice things about NFBC is you can see, all the results, and you'll see this wide range. Sometimes you'll see a player go for $70 in one league and $400 in another, and it's just, how you gauge that is kind of impossible. It's more art than science, and I also think what you said about like the good teams don't spend their money. You got to be more aggressive if you have a bad team. I mean, you can just give up.
Yeah, if you have holes, if you need it, sure.
That's I think what it comes down to is like, if you've got holes, if you were one of the teams that drafted Spencer Strider, you probably need to be more aggressive in your fab bids in general, just because you're already starting from a bad hand.
Right,
so you've got to kind of take an underdog strategy and try to make more high variance moves. And what's the difference between 15th and 13th place? At a certain point.
The only thing I would say is that, and this is less true now, it was more true 5-10 years ago, is that closers, if I lost my closer and I knew what the next line closer was, there I'd be willing to spend 100, 200, because that's something that, it's a roll. You know they're going to come into the save. You got no choice. You don't want to be behind the 8 ball with that as well. We talked actually in the prior presentation, Jason Collette had up and others had up talking about last year to this year, what has changed. I want to talk about stolen bases in particular. First, a quick agree or disagree. Do you agree that stolen bases were about as valuable as they were in 2024 as they were in 2023? Is that true? Do you agree?
Yeah.
Yeah, approximately.
About the same, roughly the same level, right? We know there was a big jump once they changed the rules with the bases and with the pitch clock and with everything, but it's been the same. Do you think that it's going to continue? Just stolen bases, we're not talking about the rest of the offense. Is that going to continue? And why I'm asking it's important, because I remember there was a whole thing, you got to push up steals. You need steals, right? Are we now out of that era in drafts where you need to push up steals? Like, obviously, the counting stats of steals are less than other categories. So, yes, you're going to have to, they're still valuable, right? You still need them.
You still need
but do you have to, can you just let your valuation system say, take them where they need, or do you need to, I'm not going to get one, I need to push it up?
So I haven't done a ton of 2025 drafts yet, but the ones that I have done, it's almost impossible not to get steals. I mean, it's someone's going to finish in 12th, 15th place in stolen bases. That's just how it works. So, you have to be conscious of it to a certain extent. But then you look at, Dylan Moore, I think, stole 32 bases this season.
Would you put him on a roster?
Yeah, that was the thing.
You
is
would?
that 32 stolen bases is a really solid number. 3 years ago, it didn't matter if that guy had, I think he had 10 home runs, 44 RBI, 53 runs scored. It didn't matter how bad the rest of the profile was. You almost had to have him. He had to be rostered.
But now you don't have to. You don't have to.
I think you can actually ignore guys like Dylan Moore and those guys who are really zeros outside of stolen bases. And so that's I think, the biggest thing. You obviously can't just punt the category, but as you go through your draft, you're going to find in 2025, more than any year I've ever played fantasy baseball, the 15th round, it's going to be way easier to find stolen bases than it's going to be to find home runs. So I think if you're, from a team building context, it's better to try to build the other 4 categories and find stolen bases throughout, rather than we're not going to do the Esteury Ruiz thing again this year, right? He's not going to be a top 150 pick just because he might steal 60 bases.
Right. You agree?
I think it's way harder to find home runs than steals, and also home runs get you more. So you draft a home run, you get a run, you get an RBI. You get 3 categories for the price of 1. Home runs are more scarce, and they get you more in the overall in terms of how you are thinking about your teams. But on the stolen base front in particular, I agree that they are about as valuable as they were before. I also totally agree with both you and Chris that home runs are more valuable than steals, and I'm prioritizing them more in my drafts. That said, I don't think we know what the stolen base environment looks like for the next 5 years. I think that teams are still figuring out a lot of what they can do with the stolen base environment and what types of risks they can take and what those risks are going to look like and how they will pan out. So earlier this year, I did a deep dive on the Cubs. It's in addition to some fantasy baseball analysis, I focus on the Cubs that bleed Cubby Blue. And they're just not running enough. They did not run enough this year in any way, shape, or form. They ran more 2 years ago. It's one of the reasons that Nico Horner went from being like a great fantasy player to being a mediocre fantasy player.
I had him on too many teams.
I'm so sorry. I did too.
And the weird thing there was they started running in the second half. They ran
Yeah,
barely
he
at
was
all
good
in the first
second half.
Yeah,
The first half was like no running. The second half was running. It was a very weird, like team philosophical thing that you could see playing out in front of you. I don't think the Cubs are the only team that is having that internal debate about how much should we run amongst themselves. And so I think that there's a very real chance that next year there's a handful of players who are stolen base guys who are going to steal 20 more bags than they did in 2024. And you have to be able to identify who those team contexts are so that you can draft those players and take advantage of it. But home runs over steals all day. Is that a question,
Is that a question, Jason? Come up to the mic, though. Come up to the mic.
It's more of a, okay.
So it's this way we can record it on the show.
The only thing I would,
The great Jason Collette.
The only thing I wanted to factor in was that as soon as the automatic ball strike system comes in, this all goes to pot.
Correct.
Because you're going to have all the throwers and all these catch framers are gone.
Yeah, I mean,
Then we
that's-
have a whole new market. That's all I want to
Yeah,
add.
no, that's going to
yeah.
change
Put
the
that lower in my
landscape for
notes.
catcher.
So the long-term prospect might be, but I think this
and
year is the
I do
same.
want to add one more thing in a similar vein to what Sarah was talking about, which is you looked at the Brewers, right? Bryce Terang went crazy. Christian Yelich had a ton of steals before his injury. Jake Bauers stole 13 bases on 14 attempts last year. Like everybody on that team ran, and then Jackson Chourio, who is this elite, like 75 grade athlete, had I think 18 steals, 19 steals. Like he was 4th or 5th on the team in stolen bases. This is a guy who very clearly has the physical skills to be a 40 stolen base guy and pretty much was throughout his minor league career. That's one where if you're looking for someone to take a big step forward in stolen bases, I do wonder if with Jackson Chourio specifically, you are 20 years old. We want to make sure you can hang at the major league level, hit. He proved that from June 1st on. He was one of the best players in baseball. I think now they're going to have give him more leash to go wild on the page.
Well, there you go. Sleeper, Jackson Chourio right there. Here's what I do want to talk about. Ellie De La Cruz. Now, I will take the loss. I will take the L, capital L. I advocated, don't draft Ellie De La Cruz. You got to be crazy. This guy could be in the minors. Oh, boy, do I look foolish with there. Or do I? My question to you guys are, the process that I had was, terrible strikeout rate. There's too many we didn't know about Noelvi Marte, but there are too many people in there. Rookie, who knows? He was terrible, prone to slumps. There were so many factors for me. Not that he wasn't bad. I'd take him in the 4th round, but 2nd round seemed like too much of a gamble. And obviously we were wrong, but the question is, did I have the right process? If this comes up again, should I be ignoring a guy like that in that context? Or what did I do wrong, right? I'm trying to learn, is this the right process or not? It certainly didn't play out, right? Process, not result. Trust the process, not results. But did I have the right process is the question.
When we talk about a player like Ellie De La Cruz, and I think, we can throw in any of the hype rookie prospects, we always focus on the big wins, right? Fernando Tatis is a rookie, Ronald Acuna is a rookie, these guys who ended up being really, really good picks. And Ellie De La Cruz, he wasn't a rookie this season, but it's his first full season. He was a very controversial player. A lot of people had him as a top 5 player. A lot of people had him outside of the top 30. I think the people who had him in the top 5 ended up being more right. And I think one of the things you talked about with Brenton Doyle is probably something that I should have processed with Ellie De La Cruz as well, which is he is a very, very good defensive shortstop. He makes a lot of errors, but he gets to a ton of balls. He's got one of the strongest arms in the league. That insulated him from playing time. And a lot of, the Reds had a lot of like quote unquote shortstops.
Yeah.
Ellie's kind of the only one who's really like a long-term surefire fit at shortstop. Matt McLain, I don't really know if he would be a long-term fit at shortstop. So that's the one where it's like a wide range of outcomes. He's a very high variance player. Still not sure if he can hit lefties. Still not sure if he can make enough contact. But I think the floor is relatively high.
Okay.
Because we know he's an elite stolen base threat who's a non-zero as a hitter. And the playing time's going to be there. He's going to hit at the top of the lineup.
So my process last year was that he does have a floor.
Yeah.
Right? So, Sarah, I'll ask you this way. Did Ellie De La Cruz, was that his ceiling last year, or is he due for a big regression? Is it just all right, a little bit of a regression? Like what do you make of him? And was my process right last year?
Oh, I think your process was right. I also advocated to not take Ellie De La
Okay.
Cruz in the first 2 rounds, and I'm not going to do it again. And I understand that other people might do that, and they might win a league that I am in, that they are also in because of that. But the for every Ellie De La Cruz that you took in the second round, there is a Nolan Jones that did nothing. There is a Royce Lewis that did nothing, right? Like, I think that we don't spend enough time on the guys who were the exact same type of prospect who didn't have that season. We remember the flashy guys who did the thing. We don't remember the guys who were drafted in similar spots who did not do the thing. And so, in my opinion, those first 5 rounds are sacrosanct. You have to hit on those first 5 rounds. They have to be guys that you think are going to play in your lineup every single day. They have to be pitchers that you think are going to shove every 5th day. They have to be closers that you think are good for 30 saves. And I don't think that we have enough data at this point in time with Ellie De La Cruz to push him necessarily into the second round. Like which means I'm going to miss out on Ellie De La Cruz, and I'm okay with that. But the Reds situation last year at this time when we were talking about it, we had no idea who was even going to play shortstop for the Reds. I think there is a very good case that Matt McLain is a stronger player overall over the next 5 seasons than Ellie De La Cruz. If we like pull all of their FanGraphs player rater data and both of them stay healthy over the same amount of time. Now, that's a big if, and it worked out for you if you drafted Ellie last year, but I don't think that's a process problem for you.
So, show of hands, who's taking Ellie De La Cruz in the first round next year? Not that many. Who's taking him in the second round? All right, is anybody not taking him in the first 2 rounds? Anybody? Not taking him in the first 2 rounds? A few? Wow, interesting.
I do think he does kind of back you into a very specific build. And like I mentioned earlier, you are going to reach a point in your draft where it's a lot easier to find stolen bases, which is the one place he's a true standout. Like, he's not
Right.
I think batting average, he's probably a likely bet to be a pretty poor contributor, but overall, he's not an Estuary Ruiz where you need 60 steals or he's just not worth having on your roster.
Right.
He's a very good player overall.
But
I think
second
there's-
round, though, you're still banking on that kind of production. Are we still banking on that kind of production?
Second round, you're passing on like a Yordan Alvarez. You're passing on a Julio Rodriguez. You're passing on people who have gone 30-30 before on the hopes that this talent will manifest itself in a way that you think is consistent enough to impact your team in the same way. And I just, like I said, those first 2 or 3 rounds, I think you take the safest bets that you can. And look, they might not pan out. Like Mookie Betts is human; he gets injured like everybody else. But I would rather invest.
But
one of
that's a
those
different
picks.
kind of not panning out.
I would rather invest one of those picks in a Mookie Betts and he gets injured than in an Ellie De La Cruz and he gets platooned.
All right, let's do a couple of quickies, and audience, please help us as well. By the way, thanks so much for the audience for coming so far. Let's get a big shout. Look at that. We got 1,000 people in the audience. Not bad. All right, agree or disagree? Agree or disagree? Luis Arias will win another batting title in his career to come. Who says he will?
Oh, in his career?
His career.
In his career, yes.
Wow,
But
look
can
at that.
Can I answer this for next year? Because I just
Okay.
have a really quick thought. I think this is a 60-40 yes, but also, like, why is Luis Arias playing in a different team on a different league like every single other year? And it's because we don't value batting average the way that we value
Or is it because
other
his
skills.
teams stink that
and
he's
he
been
keeps
on?
getting traded into other fields? I don't know, man. Like, it's hard to say if Luis Arias is going to win the batting title if he's in the AL. It's easier to say that he wins the batting title in the NL. And that's kind of a shame for Luis Arias.
All right, let's have it this one. Shohei Ohtani will not replicate his offensive production because of his pitching next year. Who thinks that the pitching is going to take a toll on it?
Also, the
A
shoulder.
lot of hands here.
I don't
Shoulder.
think there's any way he steals 50 bases while pitching.
Right.
So that alone, like,
Right.
I think who he is as a hitter the last couple of years is pretty locked in.
Right.
Like, he's going to approach 50 home runs. I think you're
He had that shoulder pop out briefly,
the
right? Oh, boy.
shoulder. And just
How much does that scare you? That
and
scares
just
me a
also
lot.
Scares
the
me.
fact that, like,
Yeah.
we have seen Shohei Ohtani remain a very good hitter while recovering from Tommy John or the internal brace procedure. He's a one of one. He's the best baseball player I've ever seen. But
Is he a top 3 pick if he doesn't pitch?
I think he's a top 3 pick either way.
Either way, I actually would not pick him a top 3 if he pitches.
Okay, interesting.
I think
you
he's
just
also-
because you just don't think the
A,
offensive
and
production
B,
will
he's
be
now
there.
doubly exposed to injury.
That's the other thing I want
Right?
to say is that, like, it's the way it's worked out. has been he has been able to play as a hitter through. And we've actually seen the first time he had Tommy John surgery,
Right.
he actually started to run more after his injury. Obviously this year, not pitching, steals 50 bases. He's physically
Right.
capable of feats that no other baseball player can do. But just the fact that he's doing both opens him up to spraining his ankle while pitching.
He's
Or
doubly exposed.
or hurting his shoulder while running the bases. So yeah, I think that's the one thing is there's an inherent risk to the fact that he plays as a hitter and a pitcher.
Do another quickie. Okay, how much will Juan Soto get in total dollars? Who thinks it's over 500 million? Raise your hand.
Oh, easy.
It's everybody. Over 600 million. Raise your hand. It's almost everybody. Almost over 700 million. Anybody?
Real value or
Total dollars. I know
Okay,
Ohtani got that.
yeah.
Total dollars. It deferred 75 years, whatever.
Yeah.
I think it's a 12-year, $600 million contract. I
12
think that,
years,
and I
okay.
think it's not deferred. I think it is to a team that is willing to not defer that money. I think that allows Juan
Okay.
Soto to say that he is the highest paid player in the history of baseball. I think that allows his agent to claim a massive win.
Okay.
And I think that that also sets up a situation where Juan Soto is being fairly compensated for being the literal reincarnation of Ted Williams without the prospect of World War II and the Korean War taking him out of the game in his peak years, which I cannot wait to see.
All right, so we're going to do some Q&A and get some questions. If you have a question, get ready. We've got a microphone here. We're going to do one more segment, but if you have your question, just think about it, and we'll call some people up. Do not be shy. That's do not be shy. But as we traditionally do on this show here, we talk first round for 2025. Who is somebody, guys, that will be drafted in the first round, or it's currently being drafted in the first round or whatever, who probably shouldn't have been? We've got Ellie De La Cruz, the possibility. Is there anybody else that you would not draft in the first round that you think people will?
I mean, this is not a person I wouldn't take in the first round, but based on the early drafts I've seen so far, I think Ohtani's going way too high. I know that's a hot
Yes.
take. This also cost me leagues last year. I had lots of leagues where I was picking in the 11-12 spot, and I shied away from him because of the Tommy John recovery. I clearly regret that now. But the shoulder injury, like shoulders are not elbows, and this is a real thing that I think we have to consider. You look at what it did to Bellinger. You look at what it did to Tatis.
Shoulders are worse.
Shoulders are a thing that can linger in a way that Corbin Carroll's first half of last season, like there's a lot of question marks in my mind about the shoulder injury. And I just don't think there's any chance he puts up the season that he had last year, like you mentioned already,
Right.
if he is also pitching. And so I think Shohei Ohtani is like one of these guys who's going in the top 5 picks. Godspeed, y'all. Somebody else can take that pick. I will not. I think that Shohei Ohtani should fall into the end of the first round or the start of the second round, given the realities of next season, and that's where I'm willing to take him.
I'm a little bit worried. I think Ellie De La Cruz is the most obvious answer for this one, but I'm a little bit worried about Mookie Betts as my first round pick. I think he's a super safe player. I wonder, what we saw this year was 2023 takes a big step forward with power, but the batting average was lacking because he had to make some trade-offs there. 2023, he takes this big step forward all around. He's able to optimize his swing path, but he's also hitting the ball harder than we've ever seen before. 2024, he comes out, I think it's 5 home runs in the first 7 games. Looks like we're going to get another massive power season from Mookie Betts. Even before his hand injury, he was not hitting for the same kind of power. I think after those first 7 games, he was on like a 13-homer pace before the hand injury. Now, the 5 homers, those happened, we'll count them. But I do worry that we're viewing Mookie Betts as a super safe source of power and batting average, and I think it might be more like 2023 where he has to sell out for the power a little bit. You're going to lose a little batting average. Still a very good player, but not a standout in stolen bases anymore. Might not be a standout in both power and batting average. So that's one where I don't think things are going to go wrong. I think it's unlikely Mookie Betts is going to be the wrong pick anywhere in the first round. I mean, top 3 probably shouldn't do it, but he might not be the right pick, given that I do think, especially in a 12-team context, I think there are probably 15 hitters who I view as first-round caliber.
Okay.
And I think I'd rather pass on Mookie for what I perceive as more upside with like Julio Rodriguez is going after him. I think I'd rather take him.
Who's somebody who's not being currently drafted in the first round that you probably think should? Sarah?
I think that the best pure hitter on the planet is Jordan Alvarez, and if he is healthy, he should be a first-round pick, period, the end. Like, if you are drafting at the end of a first round and you have a chance to take Jordan Alvarez as your best hitter, do it, as long as there is not a guy on the board who is already a 5-tool player.
Okay.
That was exactly my answer. And it reminds me a lot of Jose Ramirez this time last year,
Yes.
where, look, Jordan Alvarez is not going to have a 40-40 season. But what we saw with Jose Ramirez in 2023 was, for the most part as a hitter, he looked like the same guy. He had the home runs were down, but it wasn't like, oh, we're worried about Jose Ramirez. He had a really weirdly low run and RBI total. And that was what happened with Framber Valdez this year, where for the most part, he still looked like himself. There were some stretches where he was struggling, but for the most part, it was still, this guy's a top 5 hitter on planet Earth. And the counting stats just weren't there in a way that was kind of weird for the Astros as a whole, because the offense was effective overall. It was still one of the top 10 offenses in baseball, but the top guys didn't have the counting stats. I think Jordan is going to come out, I think, 100. He's one of the handful of guys. I think 100 runs, 100 RBI should be the floor.
Can anybody guess my pick for this? Freddie Freeman. Freddie Freeman. He's going pick 28 right now in drafts. What? By the way, Freddie Freeman, he finished as a $22 player. He's finished with over $25 worth like every year in the last, 5 years before then. What you want in your first round is somebody who's going to be consistent. And by the way, he had problems this year.
Yeah.
I heard that his ribs were hurt and his ankle was hurt. His kid had
Obviously,
issues.
the stuff with his kid.
The
Yeah.
kid-
I mean,
the stuff with his kid.
and he still managed to. He looked pretty darn good for the last 5 games, wouldn't you say? What has changed from last year to the year, from this year to last year with Freddie Freeman? Nothing. He stole 9 bases. He still had plenty of power. He had 20 homers, not 30. Okay, but I think if this is a big thing, and one thing I'll say is that the consistency is worth so much more because it's about not taking on risk. If I and I've asked this question, if I would say I'll guarantee you a $25 player, or you can take Ohtani or Bobby Witt Jr. Anybody, somebody who's top 3. Who would you rather take? An uncertain, maybe he gets injured, maybe he misperforms, or a guaranteed $25 value? Most people will go with the upside. I think that at some point, $25 is worth just as much as that. So why wouldn't I want to take a Freddie Freeman in the second round, where I think he's probably even low first round value?
Well, and you don't have to look that far for Freddie Freeman having, top 5, top 7 upside. Obviously 2020 was a shortened season, but
What
he
did he
did
do
it
the
there,
previous
and then
year? Top
2023.
5 player, right?
He was
I mean-
incredible. So yeah, I think that is one of those ones where we tend to mistake consistency for a lack of upside.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily how it works. Every player has a wide range of outcomes. For some players, it's much wider. Freddie Freeman, just because he tends to hit a relatively high bar every year doesn't mean that he doesn't have the high bands in his range of outcomes as well.
All right, we're going to do some questions now. Quick Q&A. All right. State your name and your question. We'll try to answer it.
Hi, I'm Asher. Oh, Nick's not here, so I won't be able to impress him with my question prowess. This is kind of a two-parter, but it's related to the player injury stuff.
Ruvain's not here, by the way.
Huh?
Ruvain's not here this time.
But
I get it.
nothing more susceptible to injuries, obviously more susceptible to pitching-specific stuff, but you mentioned like twisting his ankle. Does that not apply to every position player? They're all running around, outfielders run into the wall all the time. Second half, if Jordan Alvarez is healthy, how load-bearing is that if we know his knees are balky and he misses time with these very vague, like parts of him are sore, we don't really know why. How much does that concern you?
So I'll answer the Shohei part. The risk is increased because if he's pitching, if he hurts something in pitching, that will carry over to the hitting part of him, and vice versa. He's on the field in some capacity much more than the average player, right? Pitchers in general are very susceptible to injuries, period, right? So if you tell me that, okay, you now have to pitch, all of a sudden you can have a shoulder injury, an elbow injury, right? And that will affect his numbers. If he wasn't pitching, certainly that wouldn't affect he'd be able to stay healthy more, right? It's not going to be double the risk, but he's a lot more exposed, right? So that's for sure true. Anybody want to answer the Jordan part of it?
I mean, I can answer a couple of parts of this. So I hear that. Like the Yordan Alvarez injury risk seems to be baked in at this point. He's going to miss some number of games over the course of the season. The big difference between these two guys for me is that Shohei is going number 1 overall in early drafts or in the top 4 in early drafts on the basis of a season that is not the season he's going to play next year. He's going to play a fundamentally different season where he's pitching and doing some other things. And we just saw him partially subluxate his shoulder, and the last 5 guys we've seen do that did not come back anywhere near the same. So the idea that you're going to take a guy in the first 5 picks who has that shoulder injury along with a structural change in their role really freaks me out. Whereas Jordan Alvarez, it's like you're taking him somewhere between pick 12 and say pick 17, like in that back end of the first round, start of the second round. I am willing to bake in some like best hitter on the planet for the 550 plate appearances I get him for, but I'm not going to get him for 620 plate appearances for Jordan Alvarez there, especially when he's not dealing with a specific injury. Like if Jordan Alvarez was dealing with a partially dislocated shoulder, we would be having a different conversation, but he's not. He's dealing with a history of a number of aches and pains and things that have kept him out of the lineup. And the draft capital is 10 picks lower than Shohei Ohtani in the first round. And look, if I'm going to take somebody in the first 5 picks, I need to nail that pick.
And I think you brought up the knees, and that was the big concern, right? He was a 22-year-old who had both of his knees were just bad. And that was really concerning. Over the last couple of years, it really, like I'm looking at the list of things he's missed time with, and right hand inflammation. He's had some setbacks with that, but for the most part played through it. He had an ankle injury at the end of 2022. He had a strained right oblique in 2023. Last year, for the most part, it was just he had one stint where he missed a little bit of time with a knee injury, but it was like 2 days. So I'm more concerned, and I know this is a point of contention among a lot of fantasy players. I'm more concerned about this guy has one specific problem that comes up over and over and over again. That for me is a bigger concern than like, well, his hand was hurting and then he had no, like, those don't, like, I can't say that they're not, like, Byron Buxton and Mike Trout are good examples of it's a different injury every time, but there's always something. And you reach a point where I think you can just say, there's just always going to be something with Byron Buxton. Yeah, I don't know if I'm ready to say that with Jordan Alvarez.
And by the way, remember you talked about a shoulder and about Corbin Carroll. Anybody worried about him last year and said, you know what, I don't want to take him top 5? Well, that paid off, right?
We got more questions?
Yes, definitely. We've got a couple. And if you have other questions, get ready. We got a little bit of time for questions, of course.
Yeah, Eric Alterman, longtime listener, first-time caller here. Going back to earlier in the show, you were talking about areas where we all sort of ignore the projections for better or worse. And I'm really curious your guys' thoughts on non-closing relievers. If you look at the auction calculator before the draft, you're going to get a whole bunch of setup men, middle relievers who project for $2 to $7. If you look at the earned value at the end of the year, here's a few relievers who earned at least $5 and saved no more than 10 games. Ryan Walker, Tyler Holton, Griffin Jacks, Jason Adam, Luke Weaver, Cade Smith, etc. There's a whole bunch of them. There's always enough for everybody to have one on their team at least. But if you look at anybody's rankings, they're not ranking these relievers there. Yeah. They're not ranking them where the projections say, and they're not ranking them where they finish. Is that an example of everybody ignoring the projections and just straight up being wrong, or are we correct that we all ignore that?
Can I?
Yeah, I have an answer, but yeah.
I think the list of names that you mentioned kind of answers the question, though, doesn't it? Like, outside of, like, Jason Adam, I think was one of the high priority non-save guys among middle relievers last year. Right. The rest of those guys were complete non-factors.
Like Jax was the backup.
Yeah, Griffin Jax, I guess.
You had Jax when you lost Johan Duran. Like, that was great. You got 10 saves and you got some awesome ratios.
Like, Luke Weaver was not someone. Tyler Holton. There was another guy you mentioned. Cade Smith. Yeah, like, these are, I think, pretty talented pitchers, but there are always these spikes, and sometimes they prove, like Devin Williams, 2020 I think was his first big season, and I was very skeptical that was going to continue. Turns out he's just one of the best relievers on the planet.
So,
But there's a lot of pop-up guys at reliever that make it hard to go into your draft expecting them, even if we know there will be a dozen or so non-closers who are fairly valuable.
right. Do you remember Andrew Miller from a couple years ago? The question is, oh, wow, that guy is, worth $7, $8. Should we get him? And the answer is no. Because these guys, first of all, the relievers year to year, not that sticky in terms of success. They're usually more stickier in season, not season to season. The other thing I'd say is that they're free. You can get anybody who's good and who will do that role free. Why would you draft a middle reliever? Other than a save speculation, for the ratios, you can get anybody. All those guys, Tyler Holton, I picked him up in the middle of the season, free. Is there anybody spending $1 on? Griffin Jax was only because of the closer role, but the answer is no. So it really doesn't matter where you rank them. You're not going to spend. You shouldn't spend money on them.
They're fungible. They're
fungible, ultra fungible, and you can't predict it year to year. Not worth spending the money anyways. And it's not projections getting it wrong. It's just a question of it's not worth projecting, oh my God. And again, projections do the best they can, but these relievers are stickier year to year. They're harder to project. The accuracy of that is lower.
I'm going to zig a little bit here. So a couple of things. One is that you have to roster 9 pitchers if you're in like a standard NFBC format. And one of those pitchers could be a Matt Strahm, who's going to give you some multiple innings, ridiculous ratios, a ton of strikeouts, maybe the occasional vulture winner save. Or one of those guys could be the equivalent who's going to blow up. You would obviously rather have Matt Strahm. And I think that all of us have probably been in a situation where the pitchers who exist on the waiver wire who can give you wins or saves are suboptimal for a variety of reasons. Actually, one of those last picks that I talked about earlier in the show that I like to make is some secondary reliever who is next in line for saves, who I trust on the ratios front, who I trust on the auction value front, who I know is going to give me a ton of strikeouts, because I would rather have a Griffin Jax waiting in the wings than have to spend fab money on them when Johan Duran gets hurt. And so I think that if you're in a draft and you're thinking about one of those last 2 or 3 picks, draft Ryan Walker, draft Matt Strahm, draft a Griffin Jax, see what happens. Be willing to drop that guy. Like, that guy's not necessarily going to win your league for you. But, Eric, you and I play in Glarf together. There was a moment 3 weeks from the end of the season where I can't remember who I was yelling at in our DM. I think it was Mike Carter, but it was like, we got into a bidding war. We got into a bidding war over Brant Herter. And it's like, and you know why we got into a bidding war over Brant Herter? Because both of us needed strikeouts. Both of us needed a shot at saves. Both of us needed really good ratios. And that's a tough league. That's a really tough league. And so I think the smartest fantasy baseball players, when the saves are gone, when the wins are gone, they are looking at that next tier of middle relievers, and you could do worse.
Yeah. And last thing to note is that you should be playing, or you should have a middle reliever on your roster, especially in those like 15-team leagues or deeper, because they do have value, because the starting pitchers, there's nobody on the waiver wire. Like, I'd rather, and I do this, I will play the middle reliever because I don't trust this guy. I mean, when I'm going down the waiver wires, I'm like, all right, what are the matchups? Let's see, Colorado, next. Chicago White Sox, next. Like, there's nobody. Washington, next. There's nobody to pick. Middle relievers will have value because the starters just don't have it. Question?
Yes, hello. My name's Mitchell. I'm just a podcast listener. I've listened to all of you for a long time, so I appreciate all the content.
Thank you.
First of all, I was here a little late. So, did you all talk about who your first pitcher is on?
No, we didn't cover that. We didn't.
If you can just briefly, I know it's probably a long, lengthy conversation, but is there someone that you have in mind as a pitcher that would go one? Is there a definite number one? And what round would you select that number one pitcher? Yeah,
I think Skubal's the clear in terms of talent. I think he's as good as anyone in baseball right now, and obviously, it's a little concerning that he didn't become this good until he had flexor tendon surgery, but he hasn't had any issues since then, despite seeing velocity jumps both seasons. There's no such thing as a safe pitcher. It's an oxymoron. I'll take the guy that I think is the best who doesn't have any current health concerns.
Yep. Sarah, you agree?
I mean, Skubal is my number one overall too, but I'm going to make things interesting to answer your question for a second. The guy that I keep coming back to, who is the most valuable pitcher over and over and over again over years, is Zach Wheeler.
Yeah.
And it's like Skubal spikes and Strider spikes, and maybe this year it's Skeens who spikes, and maybe it was Cole a couple of years ago. The guy who is like top 5 year after year after year with the innings and the wins and the Ks and the everything is Zach Wheeler. And so I'm actually looking to build my drafts where Zach Wheeler is the dude that I get, and maybe he's the third or fourth pitcher off the board, and I get him in the late second round, early third round. But while everybody else is like fighting over Strider and Skeens, well, Strider not this year, but like Skeens and Skubal and whatnot, I'm going to wait for Zach.
He's a perfect anchor.
Yes.
Where
Yeah.
if you draft Wheeler, you can be a little less aggressive with your 2, 3, and 4 starters.
This is a good point that Sarah makes, and the thing to learn is that as a fantasy player, doesn't matter who the first number 1 is or the number 2. It matters what the difference is to the market and what'll get you more value. Would you rather have Wheeler going late second round or Skubal in the first round? I'll take the Wheeler in the second round. My answer to the question, it's also Skubal, although I think Skeens is a decent. I don't see that much injury risk with him. I see just great success. I'd be comfortable with like a very close number 2 to him as Skeens.
I just always struggle with, and maybe it's not fair, he just hasn't had the opportunity to do 180 innings. I always struggle to.
He's done college. He's done great.
Yeah,
and,
no, it was like 120 innings, but like
I'm
huge
comfortable.
workloads. Yeah, no, I think he seems about as safe as a 24-year-old starting pitcher who's never thrown 180 innings.
Yeah.
That's a pretty unsafe population of players, though.
Yeah. We'll do one more question, but before then, very quickly, where would you draft Strider this year?
So I was looking back at the Pitcher List podcast draft, and Strider went pretty late, actually. He went in like the 8th round. That's crazy. You can get a first-round value in the 8th round, and by all accounts, the type of Tommy John surgery he had and what he was dealing with is a slightly different injury than the fully torn UCL. It's like some bone spurs situation. So
Yeah, he didn't have Tommy John, right?
I love.
Yeah, it was because it was initially reported as Tommy
Yes,
John.
it's
I think
not
it ended
quite
up being
Tommy John, yeah.
UCL damage caused by bone spurs. They did the internal brace, so
Yep.
he has a very good chance, from what I understand, of being ready by opening day.
8th round sounds pretty.
So when
pretty
he's
like
falling
Yeah.
to the 8th round, by all means, I'm all in on Strider at that price. I think that's a great pick.
Well, what about Chris Sale? Anybody who thinks Sale's going to last all year next year? I mean, he already had an issue at the end of the year. Where would you draft Sale if you had to draft today?
That is one that,
I'm
like,
out.
I think he is a top 5 starting pitcher.
When healthy.
I will not be drafting him.
Right.
Like, I will rank him in the top 5. I will probably not be the person to draft Chris Sale.
Let me just say,
Tough question here, right? Yeah.
I live in Chicago. I'm a Cubs fan, not a White Sox fan. My AL team is the Red Sox. Godspeed to all of you Chris Sale drafters. It will not be me. I think he probably goes in the 3rd or 4th round, and I'm probably going to take George Kirby instead at that point.
Yeah, I'm not taking Sale there. I'll take him as my 4th, 5th starter, maybe, because of the upside right now. But to be honest, I'm probably out totally. All right, last question. Come on up.
Hey there, Kyle Bland. I'd like to shout out Sarah. I'm in the PL mock draft with her, and I took Wheeler at the end of the 2nd, so I agree with that analysis 100%. Someone I'm really interested in this year is Brent Rooker. Obviously had a huge year last year, kind of seemed to come out of nowhere, but he did have 30 homers in 2023, hit 246, which isn't great, but I don't think it's better than I thought he was, kind of thing. And so going into next season, especially with the park change, where do you see him as a hitter? Because I really like him. I see him even towards the end of the 2nd. I'd start thinking about it. He lasted till the end of the 3rd in our mock draft earlier. So your thoughts?
By the way, his BABIP last year was a robust 362, and he's not a fast guy, so that's a very lucky BABIP.
Yeah, but when you look at the expected stats, he had a 472 expected WOBA on contact in 2023, which is a good mark. And then in 2024, he takes this big step to a 534 mark, which was behind only Aaron Judge and Shohei Ohtani. He also cut his strikeout rate. Like the underlying numbers, however much stock you put into StatCast data, mostly suggests it wasn't a fluke. Like, even though he had the high BABIP, okay, maybe he's more of a 275 hitter than a near 300 hitter like he was this year. But you're talking about really high-end exit velocities. Not a great athlete still. I think stole 11 bases this year. Like, I think the biggest thing with Brent Rooker is it makes sense to be skeptical. I have seen very early drafts where he's gone top 50. I have seen one that I think it was a 15-team league. He went in like the 9th or 10th round of a 15-team league. So that's one where, like, I get being skeptical if it costs you a 4th-round pick or a 3rd-round pick in a 15-team league. That, he's util only. That's a hard player to make work. It does seem like a high-variance profile. If he's going to fall to the 6th, 7th round, and I think, we've got a decent number of util-only players that I think it kind of weirdly pushes all of their value up because someone's going to have to start Shohei Ohtani, Marcell Ozuna, Kyle Schwarber. Like, these guys there's a lot of util-only guys that have to be in your lineup. At some point, fading them just doesn't make sense if 8 of the 12 teams in your league are going to have a util-only player. It lowers the risk of having that guy, even though it is a headache to have to manage. I think Brent Rooker probably should be around 50th. If he goes there, I'm not going to draft a ton of him. But if the ADP is 75th or later, I'm probably going to have a lot of Brent Rooker on my teams.
So a couple of thoughts on Brent Rooker. Brent Rooker has saved my season twice. 2 years ago, I picked up Brent Rooker off the waiver wire for nothing, like a $1-2 fab pickup. Huge surge in home runs, absolutely saved my season. Last year, I was able to do the same thing because people still didn't believe. I'm just going to tell you, you mentioned Kyle Schwarber, who's one of my favorite players of all time. Kyle Schwarber was one of the top 20 pitcher and hitter Fangraphs player raters overall values last season. And you might have been scared away by the average that he's put up and the strikeout rates and whatever. But Kyle Schwarber gave you top 20 player overall value. You got him in like the 5th round. If you could, and if you could do that with a Brent Rooker, you should absolutely do that. And you should not hesitate. You should do it twice if you can. Brent Rooker plays for a team where he's going to play every day. If he gets traded, he's going to get traded to a team where he plays every day. And when you pull up his StatCast player profile on Baseball Savant, all you see is red. He's got a 96th percentile xWOBA. He's got a 97th percentile xSlug. He's got an 89th percentile average exit velocity. He's got a 97th percentile barrel rate. He's got a 92nd percentile hard hit rate. I love it. Sign me up. I'm in on the Brent Rooker train, and I was mad that you got him ahead of me.
And he did all that while having forearm surgery right after the end of the season. Like, that was a big part of why he's only DH. I think he didn't play the outfield after the beginning of May or June. So he should be outfield eligible this season.
Yeah,
it sounds like the plan is he's going to play the outfield to start next season. So he might just be a util-only player for 1 week, in which case, I mean, he might need to be a top 50 player. Yeah.
Do you see him as indistinguishable from Kyle Schwarber or very close in value?
I would probably take Schwarber ahead of Brent Rooker only because I think the leadoff hitting for the Phillies, the team context, and the fact that Schwarber has hit over 40 home runs multiple times pushes me over the edge. But Rooker, I think, could be Schwarber in a different
whoever
park and team
is drafted
context.
later. Like, it's a hot spot.
Yeah.
Take the best value between the two.
And
similar profile.
Ozuna's probably in that same range.
Ozuna
might be a stronger hitter among the three of them.
For sure.
Those three are good. All right. These are very indistinguishable profiles. Take any of them. All right. Well, it's the end of our show. Want to thank our guests. Thank you so much, Sarah Sanchez and Chris Towers. And I'm Ariel Cohen. Thank you so much for joining the show. And from all of us here at Beat the Shift, we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Beat the Shift podcast presented by Fangraphs. Follow us on Twitter at beat_shift_pod.